In this activity, we will look at several, but not all, of the forms of African socialism that emerged during the course of the Cold War. To give you some context of the Middle East, during the course of the Cold War, the United States and Washington supported most of the conservative states, the right-wing states and the far right-wing states, as well as the monarchies, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Iraq early on, and Iran early from 1953 onward. Then, the Soviet Union supported mostly the secular states, the states that would be generally centrist to center-left. They also supported Arab socialism, so Egypt, Syria from 1966 onward, then Iraq from 1958 onward, and those in northern Africa. The formation of the Arab League does not necessarily agree with Cold War generalizations. Both Washington-aligned and Soviet-aligned and non-aligned states, so all three groups were part of the Arab League. The Israel and Palestine conflict, as well as the Iraq-Iran wars, were the major conflicts of the 1960s through the 1990s. In 1951, the Iranian parliament nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, creating further conflict over resources in the region as British and the successor empire of the Americans bitterly attempted to hold on to their perceived monopoly over access to oil through negotiating with monarchies. In 1953, the Iranian coup d'etat and the 1979 Iranian Revolution shifted the perspectives of several leaders in the region with respect to American influence. Clearly, in 1953, the United States intervened to prevent the growth of democracy and restore a monarchy. In 1979, a popular revolution overthrew the American-backed regime. In northern and western, as well as some of eastern Africa, but especially in northern and western Africa, the post-World War II and the Cold War period was marked by the dramatic growth of independence movements and post-colonial movements. The Algerian War of Independence and the Angola crisis of 1975 were key events during this period, but Ghana was also a very important location for the symbolism of African independence. Kwame Nkrumah, the Ghanaian independence leader, reflected upon the situation in 1958, stating, "We cannot tell our peoples that material benefits and growth and modern progress are not for them. If we do, they will throw us out and seek other leaders who promise more. Africa has to modernize." Commenting on the nature of the emergence of developmentalist rhetoric during the course of the late 1950s and early 1960s. The Maghreb Union emerged as a popular anti-colonial movement in northern Africa in response to continued French attempts at colonialism and a desperate attempt to cling on to the French Empire. France, however, granted Morocco and Tunisia independence in 1956 to counter the Maghreb Unity's growth and isolate the Front de la Libération Nationale of Algeria. Creating a pan-Maghreb unity group would have supported Algerian independence, and this was not something that French colonialists wanted. The Rassemblement Démocratique Africain, or the RDA for short, wanted a unified Francophone West Africa to be independent of France, and Léopold Sédar Senghor supported this idea as an important independence leader. He additionally warned against balkanization, since it had evidently supported continued French imperial interests, which relied upon a notion known as loi cadre. Ahmed Sékou Touré in Guinea and Nkrumah in Ghana oscillated between the USSR, the Soviet Union, the United States, France, and Britain during the 1950s and the 1960s, and an attempt to remain independent. It is within the context of the post-war oscillations and the Cold War oscillations that African socialism grew in response to the projections of American neo-imperialism and European neo-imperialism in Africa. The PAIGC, the African Party of Independence of Cape Verde, or the Partido Africano de Independencia de Cabo Verde, was a former socialist party and is in fact currently a social democratic political party in Cape Verde that was against the continuation of Portuguese colonial rule. Its members are nicknamed Os Tamborinas in Portuguese, or the Tamarins, and they identify themselves with the color yellow. The Liberation Front of Mozambique was a popular movement for the liberation of sections of Mozambique. You also have the popular movement for the liberation of Angola and the growth in Somalia of Mohammed Siad Barre's groups, as well as in Ethiopia of Mengistu Haile Mariam's Marxist Derg during the course of this development in the 1960s and the 1970s. One-party rule, or democratic centralism, as it was coined in Leninist terms, appealed to Joseph Désiré Mobutu, Habib Bourguiba of Tunisia, and these two individuals were actually the best allies of the United States during the period in question. In fact, Mobutu actually became a very right-wing figure. In 1977, there was a Red Terror, so-called, in Ethiopia, which was an internal purge of Mengistu Mariam's Derg's political enemies, and of any pro-royalist factions. Agrarian reforms moved across the continent during the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s in an attempt to actually reduce deforestation, soil erosion, and they also attempted to reduce the man-made famines of colonial powers. Really, the issue was that there was famine resulting from overdrawing of soil resources during the course of the 1970s and the 1980s, which were not themselves man-made famines, so to speak. Nonetheless, they were criticized as being similar to those of the colonial period. Responses from the IMF were even more disastrous, however. They created debt-bonded economies by the 1980s and 1990s. Forced labor practices were also encouraged by the IMF and the American-backed lenders. They supported one-party military regimes for decades. There was even more deforestation, soil degradation, and famine under the interjection of the IMF in African politics, especially in East Africa. The IMF was also criticized for supporting leaders that held on to food supplies of famine relief, forcing countries that were leaning socialist to take on even more debt to relieve their populations from starvation. Debt relief, within quotes, and increased borrowing potential was incentivized under the IMF to encourage shifts toward neoliberal economics, which only opened avenues for the extraction of natural and particularly mineral resources, as well as plantation crops such as cocoa and coffee. IMF policies created a market collapse over the course of the 1980s, and the per capita income relative to NATO states declined dramatically 30% after states switched from socialism to capitalism. Indeed, the switch from socialism to capitalism in many states was economically disastrous. Meanwhile, American corporatism had bought out many national elite classes, and by the 1980s they had almost universally succumbed to the tempting comforts of neo-colonial villas, limousines, and schooling abroad for their children, while simultaneously agreeing to cut back on modernization programs once hailed as the nation's raison d'être. Nonetheless, there was some lasting influence of these governments through the 1990s, which then continued to be broken down by American foreign policy. There are some lasting influences in the historical memory of revolutionary post-colonial movements from the 1960s and the 1970s in Africa on a case-by-case basis. For example, Lumumba's Congo testifies to the solidity of African state systems. It was highly unified, rigorously policed, and extremely controlled, but also a rapidly growing democracy. While there were Germany's, China's, Korea's, Vietnam's, Israel and Palestine, these splits battled for recognition among many African states, elevating the importance of African states within the United Nations, as one state or another could recognize the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, for example, as legitimate, or Palestine, for example, or the People's Republic of China over Taiwan, for example, while the United States bitterly clung to the states that would gradually collapse, especially in the case of the Republic of Vietnam. Nonetheless, there's been a lasting split of Israel and Palestine and lasting American backing of Taiwan, although it's notable that there are more countries in the world today that recognize Palestine as distinct from Israel, a two-state sort of system there, than the case of Taiwan. Many states in the continent of Africa existed partially or de facto independently in continental politics, but retained little to no global support or having their own seats in the UN during the course of the 1950s and 1960s. This situation dramatically changed by the 1970s and the 1980s, when almost all states in the continent had seats at the table in the United Nations. Pan-Africanism and African socialisms, different types of socialism across the continent, proliferated during this period, each quite unique in interpretation, while again representatives of the USSR, the People's Republic of China, and the United States vied for influence. There were also substantial guerrilla movements that were trained in the Congo, in Brazzaville, outside Cairo in Egypt, and outside Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, as well as in Ghana in the case of Cabral's movement for Guinea-Bissau. So, guerrilla movements could use the non-aligned states as safe ground for training to fight their anti-colonial battles during the liberationist period from the 1960s through the 1970s. Out of the various types of African socialism, there was also Islamic socialism that emerged. Islamic socialism gradually left-wing form that was Islamic internationalist, a left-wing form that promoted anti-colonialist liberation, and a rigorously nationalist and far right-wing form that essentially emerged into Islamic fascism, if you will. Siad Barre, who's pictured here on the right-hand side of the slide, is commonly portrayed as a rigorously authoritarian leader, but he was actually a member of the Islamic Socialist Internationalist left-wing movement. Islamic socialism is a term coined by various Muslim leaders to describe a more spiritual form of socialism. From the 1960s through the 1970s, Muslim socialists believed that the teachings of the Quran and Muhammad, especially the notion that zakat, there should be donations or taxing that creates donations for the poor, that these principles are compatible with principles of economic and social equality. Islamic socialists drew inspiration from the early Medinan welfare state established by the Prophet Muhammad, and Muslim socialists found their roots in anti-imperialism. Muslim socialist leaders believed in the derivation of legitimacy from the public rather than from God, however, so from the people, a sort of democratic small d democracy notion. The first experiment in Islamic communes was established during the Russian Revolution of 1917 as a part of the YC movement, an early supporter of the Soviet government, including Muslims in the Soviet Union. The Muslim Socialist Committee of Kazan was also active at this time in Central Asia. In the modern era, Islamic socialism can be divided into the leftist and rightist forms. The leftists are particularly personified by Siad Barre, again pictured here, Haji Misbah, Ali Shariati, Yasser Arafat, and Jalal Ali Ahmed. They advocated for secular, proletarian, internationalist organizations. They encouraged Muslims to join or to collaborate with one another across national borders, and they formed internationalist, socialist, or Marxist movements. The right-wing socialists, really personified by Muhammad Iqbal, a famous poet from Pakistan, Agus Salim, one of the original Indonesian patriots, Jamal al-Din, Asad Badi, were really more modernist than socialist. They were called socialist by external critics to sort of link them to Cold War politics, but they're really more Islamic nationalists in their more authoritarian forms and interpretations as well, and also modernists. They were ideologically closer to a third position in some instances. So, for example, the Al-Azhar scholar Mahmoud Shaltut was an Islamic scholar who was sort of ideological third position within this context. But broadly speaking, Islamic socialists supported not just social justice, egalitarian society, and universal equality, especially in their left-wing forms, but those who were centrists and left-wing supporters of the movement supported Islamic revivalism, and those who were on the right-wing section of the movement supported a broader implementation of different ideas about Sharia codes. Broadly speaking, all Islamic socialists rejected a full adoption of class struggle, and they kept a certain distance from other socialist movements that were not Islamic. Mohammed Siad Barre, who again is pictured here, was the president of the Somali Democratic Republic from 1969 for 3 decades until 1991. During his rule, he styled himself as Ja'ali Siad, or Comrade Siad. The Barre-led military government and state government was nominally democratic elected, but it came to power in a coup d'etat in 1969 that overthrew more monarchical forms of government. So to say that it was a military government is not exactly correct in comparison to the previous monarchies, but Barre himself did emerge from the military and stayed in power with a close alliance from the military for 3 decades. During the course of this period, there were volunteer laborers that were harvested from the broader population who supported a green movement of planting crops, of building infrastructure, of building roads, of hospitals and universities, and almost all industry, banks, and businesses were nationalized, thus breaking colonial control and Italian control in these areas. There were also cooperative farms that were promoted and established. Furthermore, One of the most successful projects of Siad Barre's government was creating a new writing system for the Somali language that was adopted much more broadly than any previous system. Literacy skyrocketed from approximately 10% to over 70% in just the course of a few years. Although his government forbade clanism and broke up traditional clans, it did stress loyalty to central authorities. The overthrowing of this government, gradually, which the Americans supported in the course of the 1990s, led to the return of the clan system and the breakup of the Somali state into what are now de facto 3 states, and an extended period of civil war.